Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time of day it is. I do hope it finds you well. My name is John, and I am an author, and welcome to my writing space. I'm coming to you here today on what I hope I'm getting more into more regular videos, sort of discussing aspects of more specific aspects of writing and world building, etc., etc. And one of the things that I've really been thinking about a fair amount recently as I'm working on my third book. And with my fourth book, the fourth book I have in my head is really going to be bringing a lot of the characters from the first three, which are largely unrelated, together is the matter of like how to build a world and how to effectively, foreshadow, drop breadcrumbs, hints, whatever you want to call it. Um, how to do that effectively, um, without compromising the current story you're writing. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit, sort of, and this is purely a writer's perspective. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the bigger, better known sort of universe, Star Wars and the MCU being two ones that have really been expanding into that territory recently. Um, and talk about that. Before we start off, though, as always, I would love to, with this whole discussion here, I would love to hear your thoughts. Good, bad, indifferent, whether you agree, what your thoughts are. Do you have other examples? Anything, as long as it's respectable, even if you disagree with me, as long as it's a respectful, thoughtful response. I would love to hear it down in the comments below, as well as it would really help me in the channel out if you were to leave a like, share, and subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. And finally, and also certainly check out the links in the description, which have the books that I've already published, as well as my websites and socials that I'd love to be awesome for you to check out and follow me there as well. Well, to start off, like specifically talking about books in my writing, I suppose to some degree, just because it's such a different medium than film or television, that in some ways I think books are, you get a little, it's a little bit easier to find this balance between sort of having a good story in the present and then setting up the future. I very much intended, I don't think it was a conscious, but almost, I would virtually guarantee, um, to some degree at least, this was, um, influenced, at least in the degree to which I'm doing it, by like the MCU, is very much my first three books serve to introduce my readers to introduce my readers to the world I'm creating, sort of the rules of the world, and just introduce some of the characters and sort of ideas that I'm wanting to, and I'm dealing with there. So you got the first book, The Shadow of the Past, is very much like your standard adventure story. It's inventing some of the rules of the world or the universe that I'm operating in, which is a universe with sort of multiple different, I call them Terra, which is basically a world that's got sun, moon, stars, gods, different land. Every world is different, and they're separated, but with powerful enough magic, they can be traveled between. They're separated by sort of the raw material of like magic, that they're sort of protected from to some degree, or sort of separated from, but can be powerful enough mages can travel between them. So the first First book, The Shadow of the Past, really just sort of introduces us to, to one of those terrors. You hear a little bit more and get some hints at sort of some of the rules or sort of the accepted behaviors of those that, travel between the Terra, and the fact that there is, interaction and stuff. But, it's very much giving, setting up the type of world. I very much, very much a lot of the book is setting up the type of world that I'm operating in. My second book, And the Sun Burned Red, is definitely a much more focused story. But one of the focuses is really diving a little bit more on how, magic, or as I tend to call it, either spell or magecraft, more is what I more commonly use in the story. But basically, taking the raw material, the raw energy of magic, and transforming it into spells and enchantments and all this other stuff, and just, the fact that you're using a natural, using a resource like that causes effects other ways, which I touch on a little bit in my first book, but, I really go a lot more detail about that. And in my third book, appropriately titled When Gods Do Meddle, is gives a little bit more insight again into sort of some of the rules and stuff for those, mages or groups of people that do or can travel between different Terra, as well as most specifically the role gods play on some of these Terra. Like, in sort of my conception, the gods are basically the immortal spirit of different aspects of each Terra. They're specific to the Terra. They're divided just like, as, with the idea on different Terras and at different times. One Terra, the sun god might be important. Another Terra, the, earth goddess might be more important. And, it's different for every Terra, but it really takes a look at this one Terra, sort of the way the gods, who, while they're immortal, they're bound to the elements specifically, because they're sort of the spirit of the world. They do get some benefit from being sort of worshipped and revered, and how they interact within their own sort of rules, with the people of their Terra, and sort of how they, as the title of the book goes, how they end up meddling in things. Um, all three of the books I set up again, kind of like a good description I have of, the first three or four of the Avengers movies, where, you have Iron Man 1 and 2, you have Captain America, you have the Incredible Hulk, you have Thor, where you just get, there's little hints dropped in, which I do in all three books. There's little sort of hints of bigger things going on, and there is one character that appears in all three books, of sort of representing this force, the fourth book is where you get a lot more information on that. But this force who's trying to, while still, like, partly he enforces the rules of, what I call Terra Magi, those that are powerful enough to travel between different worlds, and also gods, like making sure they're following the rules, but also, while operating within those rules, trying as much as possible to help and influence things for the good. So that's the one character that appears in all three books, which the fourth book, once those three main major characters end up running into each other, which it's going to be, he basically is lured them in because he's seen something in them that he wants to see about working with them, sort of creates that, balance or expectation, with that. So, and that's kind of how I did it. But, there's breadcrumbs, but each of my first three books, the two I've already published, and the one I'm working on right now, that are completely standalone. And then, the fourth book is going to bring threads in, but it's still good. My intention is, it's still, once I get to writing it, is it still going to be a standalone book? You just gain something from having read the first three and, getting information. And that brings me to some of the properties I've mentioned, and I mentioned in the title and mentioned as sort of probably most notably, they're by far not the only ones, but the MCU and then Star Wars, where you have that, where I think one of the big issues with them is how much time is I really think there's two problems that runs it. Again, film is a different medium, but how much time are you devoting in one movie or show to setting up the next movie and or show? And conversely, how much do you need to know to truly understand what is going on in previous shows? Where it works best is where it works best is that if each individual entry is more or less completely standalone, and it gives you it gives you a watching bonus. Like if you've seen the whole thing, whether it's in one sitting binging it through, or you've just watched it at some point, because of that you get the added bonus watching this new thing of being like, oh, they set that up in blah blah blah, or oh, I remember that, or oh, that's you really see their character progression. But if you watch the movie independent of anything, you still get a good picture and a good understanding of what's going on. And that's where I think one of the big problems I have with some of the new material from the MCU, which I'm at this point hopelessly behind on. And that's kind of the problem is the Infinity Stone saga, whatever, that 22 or 2022, I can't remember exactly how many movies. Um, they did a very very good job of the vast majority of those movies are completely standalone. Any setup for future progress are just hints sprinkled in, or if there's something you need to know about the previous one of the previous entries in the series, they're able to explain it pretty easily and pretty quickly. And so that leads to sort of like just a cumulative, like if you watch it all, especially from start to beginning, where you get a sense of these grander character arcs and grander things that overall works really pretty well. You start getting into, yeah, there's aspects, or there's things you start getting into, as the MCU neared Infinity War and Endgame, where it was starting to become the movies were starting to get a little bit more self-referential, um, but perhaps I couldn't tell you why, but like over perhaps just overconfidence or not fully understanding how well they did build in those foreshadowing and hints and sort of layering the stories but not required watching. The MCU since Endgame, I like it individually. I like almost everything that I've seen. Um, and this I think is a sort of an overarching. I don't know whether it's Disney, Marvel Studios, Kevin Feige, any of the I don't think it's the individual writers, but it's almost become they've made every aspect since Infinity Wars, and to a degree Infinity Wars, as they keep referencing those films, have become like required viewing in one sense or another. Like A good example of that is um, the first MCU show on Disney Plus, WandaVision, and then Multiverse of Madness. WandaVision is an excellent show. It works really very well a as a standalone show. They do a good job. The pieces of information like who is Wanda, who is Vision, you know, um, what happened with how Vision died, all that. They did a good job of of explaining that, or explaining to the audience what you need to know that you really didn't need. You get a lot more understanding, but you really didn't need to watch the Infinity Saga before watching WandaVision. Like, they gave you enough of what was going on, and there's enough focus to the whole story that you really understand what's going on. It says a beginning, middle, and end. It works really well. But then we get to Multiverse of Madness, which again, I like the film. There's a lot I think that works very well about it, but I think to a large degree, especially if for a more casual watcher, that the plot of the movie doesn't make a lot of sense unless you've seen WandaVision. And that's where the problem comes in. Is now we've gone from, you get a bonus for watching this previous information, to you have to have watched this 9 hour, or this 9 episode, I think they're almost all about an hour, this 9 hour television show to comprehend this movie. That, and the movie therefore becomes not really standalone at all. Like, you can only see, it's only that. So, like, you have to see it, in part because, again, WandaVision's a great show. It's brilliant, but what happens in WandaVision and its relevance to Multiverse of Madness cannot be easily or quickly explained. Like, they'd have been wasting, like, it would have been an incredibly clunky scene. There's a few hints to it that what you did in New Jersey and the hex and blah blah blah. That's kind of incomprehensible if you haven't watched WandaVision. Like, I don't blame them in one case. In one sense, I don't blame them for not taking what would have probably been 10 minutes of, like, Doctor Strange or somebody else going like, "Oh, remember when wound up hexing and magically kidnapping an entire New Jersey town and making it relive a bunch of sitcoms, and just to try to have your dead boyfriend's Vision back, and he got raided by the government and blah blah blah, all the other stuff that's going on." That would have been, again, that would have been fairly incomprehensible, um, if you hadn't seen it, and it wouldn't be a quick explanation. Um, and that's sort of where you get into problems. Is no longer, you've got a property that requires the previous viewing, and there's other examples of that in the MCU. And that brings us, sort of the other big property that sort of had issues with that is, not all of, but some of the new Star Wars properties have sort of run into this issue too. Some of them have done it very well. One thing, it's an entirely different topic of discussion, the pros and cons, merits, good or bad, whatever you want to say, of the Star Wars prequels, but they do function very, very well as prequels, in that each film each film is standalone. You can watch and you can understand what is going on. You get more out of it and you get more benefit, but you can understand what is going on in each of the three films. It helps that sort of the Star Wars unique opening crawl sort of helps set the stage a little bit, but that works fairly well. And it does what a good, if you're making a prequel after something is made, it does a good job of not overloading the audience with hints as to what happened, like, hints and clues as to what happened. It just lets the audience experience the journey. you know we know where it ends up. Anybody who's seen the original Star Wars trilogy, we know where things end, eventually end up. And the prequels, episodes 1, 2, and 3, are the journey that gets you there. They don't waste time like hinting and ribbing like some prequels end up doing. It's like, imagine what's gonna, see, this is gonna be a problem. It doesn't waste a ton of time on that. And in that sense, the prequels are quite successful. Same thing with Rogue One does a great job of that. That's a standalone story. You get the benefit of knowing, the next chapter, Star Wars Episode 4, A New Hope, that takes place right after it. You get benefits from watching it, but it lets the story stand on its own. You don't need to watch no Star Wars to really make sense of what's going on. And it really does a good job of sort of filling some of the holes in Star Wars, rather than this, purely heroic, just focus on the heroes and the heroic fight against, the evil empire. You actually see sort of some of the gritty details and ins and outs of a rebel movement, and the utter terror, even the concept or possibility that such a battle station as the Death Star exists, like how terrifying it is to them. So that's well done. Same thing with the show Andor, is that it's standalone. We know where we know where the character of Cassian Andor ends up. So you get a bonus if you've seen Rogue One, of seeing sort of the start of his character arc, but the story is self-contained. It doesn't, it has these little, hints and foreshadows and Easter eggs, but it doesn't waste time sort of foreshadowing the future or overly linking it to, future things that are coming up. And some of the other shows I think have been sort of a mixed bag in that regard as well. Is like first season of The Mandalorian, first and second really seasons of The Mandalorian, like, are very good standalone arcs, and the majority of the episodes are standalone. That's another thing I'll talk about, is how to break up stories and stuff like that, that I want to talk about a little bit in a future video. But it really makes it makes sense in that, but then you have season 3, which is very clearly, I mean, season 2 does it well. Like, there's a few little hints and you see sort of glimmers of what's going to end up becoming, we know is going to end up becoming the First Order and the threat of episodes 7, 8, and 9. But, it doesn't spend too much time on that. But, they've spent a fairly significant amount of runtime in Mandalorian season 3, sort of building up hints of what's clearly future projects, and building up hints of, like, the Empire's not completely dead, and, presaging the growth and threat of the First Order. Same thing is, with the show Obi-Wan, is they connected it far too heavily into the wider Star Wars story. If they had just done a story where it was, Obi-Wan trying to rescue a young Leia, and the only thing he's really dealing with is the Inquisitors, not Darth Vader. There's not huge references to the previous story, but again, like, that's it on the flip side, is, it's a fairly incomprehensible show unless you've watched episodes 1, 2, 3, 4, unless you get a really big, picture of what's going on. And just like I'm kind of thinking that we'll end up appreciating Mandalorian season 3 a lot more once we've seen, whatever this next, I think it's a movie they're working on. I can't entirely remember. It's probably changed a few times. Um, um, Similarly, I think to some degree, like too much of the Book of Boba Fett was building up and sort of giving a preview of Mandalorian season 3, which and in all of those cases, it's a little, as someone who's a very big Star Wars nerd, you know, I love, to some degree, I love the interconnectedness as a big Star Wars nerd, but sort of more casual fans, or it makes it all that much more accessible. And while I like individual pieces of I like each individual piece of all of those shows. Overall, I like those shows. The new one, The Acolyte, has the similar issue. Rather than telling a contained standalone story, takes place about 130 years before 130 years. I can't remember exactly, before Phantom Menace. Rather than telling a self-contained story about sort of the corruption, the short-sightedness, whatever you want to call it, of the Jedi Order, they tried to balance that storyline, the storyline of the season itself, with trying to look forward to to try to like set up hints of like, oh, the Sith are out there. Da, 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 da. I would never like. I am I again. I'm conflicted because I really enjoyed The Acolyte. I thought the acting, the fights, the story, all of that were great, really well done. But the aspects of it that are sort of, they spent too much time and effort and diverted the story too much to try to set up the later Skywalker saga taking place 130 years after that I think it took away from the story. And in all these other ones, these examples I get, it's not that they're not good, it's not that it doesn't, in some cases it's not that it doesn't work, but it takes away from it takes away from the story they're trying to tell, and it takes away from it being standalone. Is I really wish and I hope going into the future that more of these shows take a page from, I think one of the best examples of that I've ever seen is how J. Michael Straczynski, I apologize if I'm pronouncing that wrong, plotted out the entire 5 season run ahead of time of Babylon 5, which included like all these hints and Easter eggs to drop in, as well as, because of the, changing nature and fluctuations, whatever you want to call it, of, a television show, had what he called trapdoors, where he could remove a character or a plot piece or a plot arc with minimum fuss and minimum damage to everything else if, an actor wasn't working out, or an actor quit, or a storyline wasn't working. Is I wish they would do, there's really very much a sense, and that's part of the problem of these writers, you know I imagine, the producers, the studio, whatever you want to call it, are wanting to throw in these hints, Easter eggs, want to interconnect it. But as often the case with, producers and stuff, I don't think they really understand that like hints and Easter eggs and little bits of foreshadowing are a lot more effective in bringing in returning audience, as well as the important aspect of bringing in new audiences, than trying to like super fuse things together. That just, it makes the whole thing confusing and onerous, and takes away from one or more of these properties. And I think at its core, that's really sort of the problem, and the challenge of that type of world building. Anyway, I've rambled enough here. I'm going to finish by saying once more, I really hope you help me and the channel out. Like, share, subscribe. I would love to hear your comments and thoughts on any of the things I've said and discussed, as well as check out my books and socials and website down below. I do hope you all have a wonderful day, get a chance to do or experience something creative, and I will catch you on the next one.